Well, good morning, everybody. They asked us to submit the descriptions of our lectures early on in the semester. And before the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, I was planning to talk to you all about the impeachment process and basically recycle a lecture that I had given on that subject earlier this summer. But I think that given the nature of the confirmation hearings that took place recently and the issues that are on the Supreme Court's docket this fall, that I'm hoping it's okay with you if we talk about the midterm elections and the potential ramifications or impacts that may have on Supreme Court decision-making, the staffing of the federal courts, the personnel that are currently on the court, and the unprecedented number of appointments President Trump has been able to make to our federal courts. And so I think this is a more timely topic given the fact that midterm elections are now less than 2 weeks away. So if that's okay with you, that's what we're going to talk about today. So what I have here on the screen is a picture of the Supreme Court. We'll start up at the upper left. In 2016, when Justice Scalia was still with us. We know that after Justice Scalia passed, that then President Obama had the opportunity to fill that seat with a nominee of his choosing. It created this block of more conservative voters to the right, which would include Chief Justice Roberts, Justice Kennedy, Justice Thomas, and Justice Alito. And then on the other side of the ideological spectrum, we had Justice Ginsburg, Justice Kagan, Justice Sotomayor, and Justice Breyer. And we went through a period of time when we had that even split with an 8-member court. I'm sure you're all aware of the efforts by the Obama administration to seat Judge Merrick Garland to take Justice Scalia's place, and then the political process that was put into full swing by Mitch McConnell and the Senate at the time, and their ability to block the appointment of Judge Garland, such that the nomination would then be given to the next president, who is, as we all know, Donald Trump. And President Trump, to take Justice Scalia's place, appointed Justice Gorsuch. And that was a fairly political confirmation process. Justice Gorsuch and Justice Kavanaugh had the lowest vote margin in the Senate confirmation process of any justices since 1881. That was Justice Matthews in 1881. That's the last time that we've seen such a difficult process and procedural appointment. And so I think that's important for us all to note, is that the hyper-partisan nature of the Senate has created a change in American policy with regard to the nomination and confirmation process. It used to be, as I'm sure you're all aware, that the United States Senate was considered the deliberative branch, the branch where reasonable minds could come together and make decisions with regard to the appointment and confirmation of all of our Supreme Court justices, of our ambassadors, public ministers. But with the partisan maneuvering that was attached to the Merrick Garland process, no longer did you need the 2/3 agreement of our Senate to appoint the new Supreme Court justices. Now it can just be done by a simple majority of 50. And we have seen how that has created a more political process for the appointment of our Supreme Court justices. It hasn't always been that way. That is a new phenomenon, this only requiring 50 votes, simple majority, to decide who is going to serve on the nation's highest court. So we know that when Justice Scalia passed away, that Neil Gorsuch ultimately took his seat. We know that when Justice Kennedy announced his retirement and leaving the bench in July, that created the opportunity for what we all witnessed over the past couple of weeks, the Kavanaugh confirmation process. And we know that this has set up a shift in the political balance of the court, and that many scholars who study the court and all of their decision making, they create an ideological, basically a spectrum, and they place the justices over time on this ideological spectrum from left to right. And you can see that the political balance, the ideological balance on the Supreme Court before Gorsuch's nomination is displayed here on the left-hand side of your screen, where Justice Sotomayor, Ginsburg, and Kagan are the more liberal justices, and the way that these scholars plot these points on these lines is by looking at the decisions over time that the justices make and the language that they use in their opinion writing. And so you can see that before Kavanaugh's placement on the bench, Justice Thomas was the most conservative justice in terms of the decisions he makes over time and the language that he uses in his opinions. And then you can see that now that Justice Kavanaugh is seated on the bench, that he and Thomas are most ideologically alike in terms of their conservative issue positions on public policy and the language that they use in the opinions they write. So we see that the balance of power on the court has shifted to the right. And many scholars believe that clear partisan split is problematic. And we look to our court to be the non-political branch, to be the least dangerous branch, as Alexander Hamilton put it, to be the branch that can come together to make the decisions about public policy in a way that will further the interests of the entire populace of the United States. And so the politicization of the branch to many seems problematic, and the confirmation process of our last two justices highlights the role that politics is playing at the present moment in our staffing of our federal courts. So why do the midterm elections matter? How does that play out with regard to the Supreme Court? Well, we know that it's with the advice and consent of the Senate that these positions are filled. We saw that play out on primetime television over the past couple of weeks with regard to Justice Kavanaugh. We saw all of the pressure that was being placed on the undecided senators to see how they were indeed going to cast their vote with regard to confirming or not confirming Justice Kavanaugh. And with the midterm elections coming up, you can see the split here with the number of open seats, contested seats, the seats that are going to be decided by elections in 2 weeks, you can see that this is the battle for Senate control, the seats as they currently exist. You can see that 43 of the Republican seats are uncontested. 23 of the Democratic seats are uncontested. And so that's a much higher bar to meet, a much tougher hill to climb for the Democratic Party to maintain that control of the Senate. And you could see that if the Senate, if the Democratic Party were to take control of that body, that it would take an additional 2. They would have to hold on to every seat they have and flip 2 seats. So political pundits are not very hopeful about the partisan makeup of the Senate with regard to a Democratic Party takeover. But this is the current scenario that we're looking at in November. And again, that matters because with the president's nominations, it takes a majority of our Senate to confirm his nominees and put them on the bench. And it matters because President Trump has been able to appoint more Court of Appeals judges than any other president in history at the same benchmark at where this plot is being, this measurement is being taken. And why does that matter? Well, with the ability to staff the federal courts, the ability to place partisan nominees on the Supreme Court, comes the ability to shift public policy in ideological directions. It also matters because scholars have shown over time that justices move to the ideological poles so that we can fairly accurately predict that both Justice Gorsuch and Justice Kavanaugh, even though right now they're fairly, I think it's fair to say that they're on the conservative outlier ideological points, that we can predict that they're only going to get more conservative in their decision making over time. That has been the trend with regard to all justices over time. So you can see that President Trump has also shown a preference for nominating men and nominating white men to the bench as opposed to nominating women or nominating people of color. And so with the changing demographic makeup of our country, that also could potentially play a role. A lot of scholars believe that the makeup of the bench, the public policy is more in line with the lived experience of American people when our judges actually look like the American people. And if the bench is going to be staffed by men and white men at that, then that's not going to be in keeping with the demographic changes that we're watching take place in our country. So all of this creates a scenario of potential public policy decisions and a federal bench that reflect the priorities of President Trump and the most conservative members of the Senate. It also matters because we have some octogenarians on the bench, and I know you're all just as bright as they are and just as tough, but you know, at some point in time you get tired, and Justice Ginsburg is 85. Justice Breyer is 80. And we could anticipate that they might want to retire sometime soon from this position. And whoever holds the majority in the Senate will ultimately be the decision maker with regard to who takes their place. So we know that presidents aren't always successful in placing their nominees on the Supreme Court, but the Senate is the body that actually controls who will take those seats. And so a lot is at stake as far as the policy positions that the court is going to take dependent upon the midterm elections. And so there are some implications for the Supreme Court with this hyper-politicization of the nomination and appointment process. Again, like I told you earlier, the Justice Gorsuch and Justice Kavanaugh confirmation hearings, they both received the bare minimum of votes to be appointed to these seats. And it's a bare minimum also in terms of the fact that it just took 50 instead of the traditional 2/3 of the Senate that it has always taken heretofore before Mitch McConnell and before him, the Democratic Party with Harry Reid changed the rules with regard to stopping filibuster and how many votes it would take to stop the deliberation during the confirmation process and take the vote. We also know that this could potentially have an effect on the perceived legitimacy of court decisions. When we see that the process of placing people on the court is so political, and we see that the people that are currently staffing the court have been, well, particularly with Justice Kavanaugh, I mean, he's essentially, you know, when he was going through the hearing process 2 weeks ago, was not the least bit shy about pointing to the hyper-partisan nature of his appointment process. And so when we're looking to this body of unelected officials who have lifetime appointments to make our public policy decisions, it could potentially affect the legitimacy of the decisions that they make, the opinions that they write, the perception of members of the bar like myself. I just saw Chancellor McCoy walk in. It plays a role, I believe, and this is me stepping down from my professor seat, but when the confirmation process was so heated and ugly, my perception of the decisions that Justice Kavanaugh makes will always be shaded by what I saw him say and do in his confirmation hearings. And I can tell you that that's the same for all of the young people that are on campus. You know, the night of the Susan Collins debate, we had 200 students gathering together, petitioning the professors to come tell them, what does this mean? How is this going to affect public policy? Is there anything that can be done? And so perceived legitimacy is potentially a ramification, a victim of the politicization of this process. So back on my professor seat. Who's going to be the new median voter? It has always been Justice Kennedy. He's been the decider. I love this picture, right, of the Time magazine. He was the critical swing vote on gay marriage decisions. He played a primary role in trying to moderate the conservative bloc's opinion in the Obamacare decisions. And so with him gone, and again, he's always been this median voter. You can see him here and there. The ideological shift is plainly going to move to the right as far as the court's decisions are concerned. And so what effect is this having right now, the current makeup of the court? The decisions that are on the docket currently at the end of the October session and through November, through this winter term, they're hearing cases on age discrimination, They are hearing cases on the death penalty, two Supreme Court cases on the use of the cocktails, the lethal injection method. Also the ability to sentence people to death who are cognitively impaired. They are hearing cases on money bail, which is a big deal in the criminal justice system. The ability of some individuals to be able to get out of jail when they are arrested being solely a function of whether or not they can pay their bail. And immigration, how we treat individuals who are arrested by our immigration and customs enforcement officers. Do they deserve due process or equal protection of law? How long do they have to sit in these detention centers that are being run by for-profit companies? That's all on the ballot right now. Or not on the ballot, well, kind of on the ballot with the midterm elections, but that's all on the docket. And so, and we saw just yesterday, that this current court held that Wilbur Ross, who is in charge of the 2020 census process, this court determined that he did not have to sit for a deposition. He did not have to adhere to the judicial process to which all of us would have to adhere if we were called to give a deposition with regard to the composition of the questions on the 2020 Senate. So that's, and some people are saying that is a very political decision that was made by the court members yesterday. So, also, and I'm pretty sure that the OSHR folks make these PowerPoints available to you. So I have listed some additional resources that you can all use and get more information about the Supreme Court, some of my favorite places to gather information. I know you probably can't see that because the ink is yellow, but there's a blog called First Mondays, and it's, let's see if I can... It is hosted by professors at Columbia University Law School and Harvard, and they talk about what happened the week before and what's coming up the current week on the Supreme Court's docket, and it's great. They're very intelligent. They're ideologically very far apart, these two professors, and so you get a well-rounded analysis of the previous week's decision making and what's coming up on the docket. This is a more historical approach. It's called More Perfect, and I love to listen to it as well. The current season is following the criminal court docket in, I want to say, Detroit, and they're basically sitting in the circuit court courtrooms in the Detroit Criminal Justice Building and listening to cases from front to back and following the ability of these what happens to these individuals who've been accused of committing crimes, and the judges' decision making, the attorneys bargaining. But the last season was all about historical constitutional law cases, the most important ones, and it was great, excellent analysis. SCOTUS blog is your font of information about all things Supreme Court. And the information is populated by all kinds of different professors, reporters, attorneys, other judges, what's happening in the Supreme Court right now. They broke down, oh, you can't see those. Can you all see those? Oh, okay. Well, anyway, you'll be able to link to those websites. And there's the latest book that I think is a good read on the Supreme Court in this current moment in our history is called The Most Dangerous Branch by David Kaplan. And that's, of course, in reference to Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist Papers saying that our court would be the least dangerous branch because these individuals wouldn't be beholden to elections they would have lifetime appointments and be able to exercise their wisdom in a non-political forum. And it's a great historical analysis and also interpretation of the latest appointments and how that can potentially affect American public policy. And then, lastly, before we take questions, this is a shameless plug, totally shameless. I am running for City Council in August 2019. And I am a seventh generation Tennessean. What's important to me is kids and old folks, education, infrastructure, and ethical and fiscal responsibility. And I'm going to try to show my students what it's like to be someone that has never run for anything. I think I was 8th grade president, and that's the last time I've ever campaigned. But I think it's important that thoughtful people who are reasonable and willing to discuss issues and think through the implications of issues step up and show the next generation that at least you're willing to try and put yourself out there. So if you happen to live in District 18, I'd love to talk to you about the most pressing issues. But I also want to let you know that I care deeply about the judicial branch, and that's my branch. That's the one that I really want to protect and keep above the fray. I think it's so important that our courts stay above the political fray, and that I am concerned right now about the hyper-partisan nature of staffing our federal courts. And I'm not saying that it's any different if a Democrat were in control of the process or the Democrats were the majority party on the Senate, but I do think that we, the people, should be paying attention to the fact that this isn't the way it's normally been done. That typically these positions have been confirmed by 2/3 of the Senate, and thus it required a more moderate, nominees that would be acceptable to folks across the ideological spectrum, and that we should all just continue to pay attention with regard to the effects of our elections and voter turnout and all of that good stuff on the decisions that are being made by our Supreme Court members and the members of our federal bench. Last thing, it's important to note as well that the Supreme Court has absolute discretion over the cases that they take, and the majority of the decisions that affect public policy in our country are made by the lower courts. And as you saw in that slide, President Trump has the opportunity to right now to fully staff the lower courts, the district courts, the courts of appeals, the ones that make most of the decisions that affect you, your children, your grandchildren. And so the role that politics plays in the composition of those bodies is something we should be paying attention to as well. All right, so I think I have time left and we can open it up to questions, and I will do my best to answer them. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to understand that chart a little bit better. Mm-hmm. Have the ideological.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Is the scale the same on both sides?
Yes.
So what you take from that is.
Well, it's a scale with a median point.
So Sonia Sotomayor, by the way, my classmate, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg are less liberal than Brett Kavanaugh and Clarence Thomas are conservative by one tranche of whatever that bars are.
Yes, yes,
So that it's
yes.
not just that it's on different sides,
It's a degree of, yes.
Are even righter or even more conservative than the liberals are.
Yes, that's a correct interpretation of this ideological scale. Yes, yes, yes. So they, usually these scales are, when you look at the Gallup polls or Pew Research Center, they have a median point, and then the question is typically leaning liberal, liberal, extreme liberal, right? Or leaning conservative, conservative, extreme conservative, with that median point being in the middle. And that's what this is trying to plot as well. And so, yes, this is showing that, you know, this would be your leaning liberal, your liberal position, and, you know, then extreme would be over here, and then this would be leaning conservative, conservative, and most conservative. Yes, ma'am.
I went to vote early yesterday,
Yes, ma'am.
and I've never seen so many people. Never. And what's that mean?
Well, yes. So your classmate said she went to early vote yesterday, and she has never seen that many people at the polling place casting their votes early. I think it's a function of a couple of things. We know that Tennessee was 49th in the nation in terms of voter turnout in 2016. So we got a lot of attention for that. We got a lot of you know, allegedly nonpartisan interest groups wanting to come in and do their best to increase voter turnout. We also know that women in Tennessee between the ages of 18 and 35, 49th in the nation. And so I think we got a lot of attention for those two statistics and a lot of interest in boosting our numbers and the public information efforts to get out and vote have been targeted because our numbers were so dismal. I can also tell you that as the director of undergraduate studies for the political science department, that I'm in charge of determining whether or not students get academic credit for their internship experiences. They have to meet a pretty rigorous test to have that count as a class. And the number of students who are participating in midterm election campaigns hasn't been this high since 2008. So I think that's a function of interest and another metric to look at in terms of young people deciding that they want to participate. So I don't know. You know, I think we learned from 2016 that a lot of our political pundits, including our own illustrious Joshua Clinton, who, you know, works for several of the political polling entities, MSNBC, and they all got it wrong with regard to the prediction of the presidential election. So I don't think you can put too much faith in what you see with regard to public opinion polling right now. But I think things like lots of people showing up to early vote, the money that's being poured in, it's disgusting. In my opinion, the role money plays in politics is abhorrent. It's undemocratic. It makes it just a millionaire's club. I mean, when I think about running for public office, I get sick. They tell me I have to raise just a ridiculous amount of money just for a city council seat, and that if I can't do that, don't even bother. You know, and that automatically precludes decent people who care from even trying. But the money being poured in on both sides to the party machines is out the roof. You know, and I think I think people realize that the Senate races are really, really important as far as the direction of public policy for the foreseeable future, because they will control our courts. And we know that the courts control our public policy. Yes, ma'am?
Well, it seems like the change you're saying is when the two-thirds vote changed. What happened? Why did that occur, do you think?
So when President Obama was trying to nominate and appoint members to the federal bench, to the lower court positions, district court positions, court of appeals positions, the Republican Party was able to filibuster ad nauseum and basically preclude ever being able to cast that, okay, it's time to vote. And so Harry Reid and the members of the Democratic Party who were in control of the Senate at the time said, well, we're gonna change this procedurally so that we can stop them filibustering and we can just move forward with our appointments. But with all things political, you have to anticipate the consequences of your actions. And so now that has created the scenario where our most recent Supreme Court justices are put in their seats in a way that hasn't been the norm. It used to require appointing somebody that could gather votes from both sides. Yes. Yes, sir.
I understand that's a change in a Senate rule.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Is there any interest is anyone speaking about correcting this either through legislation or constitutional amendment?
Not that I know of. Yes. So how could we fix this? How could we change this Senate rule to bring it back to the requirement of a 2/3 vote? It would require a constitutional amendment would certainly fix it in a way that, regardless of which party is in power, that would now be the rule. Otherwise, it's a function of party leadership and who holds the power, who has the numbers. Yes, sir.
And just as a point of clarification, I had heard on one of the networks that Harry Reid invoked that change in procedure for all the seats up to but excluding the Supreme Court, and that it was Mitch McConnell who took it to the Supreme Court.
That's correct. That is correct. So Harry Reid invoked the rule for all lower court judges, created this rule change, internal Senate rule change for our district courts. We have 3 here in Tennessee, 1 in each Green Division, and the circuit courts, which are the courts of appeals that hear appeals from those trial courts. But it wasn't supposed to apply to our Supreme Court justices, and it was Mitch McConnell that essentially created the scenario that we're looking at right now with regard to the Gorsuch and Kavanaugh hearings, where it just took 50. And we knew that, even if it was a 50-50 split, what would happen next? The vice president. They get the final say. So, yes, ma'am.
Related to contributions and for political races, how can that be changed from the Supreme Court ruling to make it more logical and so it's not a rich person running for office? Someone would need to pass legislation. So she was asking, how can we change the role of money in politics? Why does it have to be a millionaire's club? And it would require someone passing legislation. In my opinion, we should publicly finance our campaigns so that it would stop the role that corporate interests play. That's the way it's done. If y'all have ever traveled abroad, I remember going to Ireland for a wedding years ago, and they have like 2 weeks to campaign. and they have debates every other day, and then it's done, right? And it's publicly financed. And it's not beholden to corporate interests. And so that could be done. We could, if there was enough political will behind it. And of course, we know that God rest his soul, our patriot John McCain and Russ Feingold tried to pass legislation that would limit the role that corporate money and interests could play in our elections, but that our Supreme Court undid it with the Citizens United decision. And of course, they would claim, the Supreme Court would say that, well, they were protecting the substance of the First Amendment, that people should be able to
to use the media to sway public opinion, but it also, in that decision, opened the floodgates to money being poured into our elections by special interests that want to own politicians and thereby influence public policy. But we could certainly create legislation, create a constitutional amendment that would create public financing of our elections. Will that ever happen? But maybe. I mean, a lot of people probably didn't think that gay people would ever get married or that pot would be legal on the whole West Coast. So you never know. You never know. Yes, sir. So yes, whoever controls the leadership of the Senate would be the party or the individual that could change this rule, that could take us to the more moderate 2/3 requirement with regard to our confirmation process. In an ideal world, we would have senators that would care about that and that would make that happen and that would look at what's going on right now and say, this is so hyper-political, can we please get back to a position where you had to have somebody that folks could agree on? We don't have to, I mean, whoever's in power, you don't have to put your ideological poles, but you could find somebody that is willing to work with others and meet in the middle and have reasonable discourse. And the 18th district here in Nashville is Vanderbilt. Belmont, it goes from Wedgwood to Woodmont, and it goes from 12 South to West End. So it's a very politically active district. Berkeley Allen has been our wonderful council member for the past 2 terms, but she's term limited, and so it's an open seat now. And my personal position is that government exists to solve our collective action problems, that most of us should be able to make decisions for ourselves about how we want to raise our families, what we want to do in our bedrooms and bathrooms, but that when it comes to sanitation and education and transportation, things that we can't buy on our own or pay for on our own, that it's more efficient if we all work together, that those are the things that government should concern itself with, and not divisive wedge issues that create a breakdown in civil society. And so I think, that, for example, the vice mayoral runoff election, that cost our taxpayers, $85,000. That's, we could hire 2 teachers for that, right? And that's pathetic that we could hire 2 teachers, that's all they get paid, but that's a waste of money in my opinion. And so that process could be more streamlined and more efficient, and I think that those are things that government should try to do as opposed to waste money. Yes, ma'am.
Expound on potential constitutional convention.
Constitutional conventions. So, we know that we can amend our Constitution in a couple of ways. Through Congress or through 2/3 of the state legislatures calling for it. And that's why we all need to pay attention to who sits and controls our state legislatures. Because we are real close to 2/3 of our state legislatures being controlled by one party. And if that were to happen, they could call for a constitutional convention to pass an amendment. And it would require both Congress and the state legislatures to do that, it can't happen just, just the states, or they have to have Congress on board too. But they could potentially amend our Constitution if 2/3 of our states were politically motivated enough to call for constitutional conventions and put amendments either on the ballot, and that varies from state to state what it would look like. Would it take any type of popular feedback, or could it be a decision that's just made in the state legislature themselves? So a lot of people want to call attention to that, and I think that's smart to pay attention to that as well, because our state legislatures, if 2/3 of them were willing to get behind a constitutional amendment, irregardless of the content, then that is a method. It's never been used, but it's a method of amending our Constitution. Yes, sir.
Could you talk for a second about the Merrick Garland nomination and Mitch McConnell not moving that forward? Is that legal?
Legal scholars pointed to language in the United States Code that called for the movement forward of this process. That was one legal provision that was looked to that would indicate that it was the Senate's responsibility, their legal responsibility per United States law, to take a vote one way or the other. So many people say that was not legal. It was certainly political. That's fair to say. And it was successful, clearly. So, but as I tell my students lots of times, there's a marked difference between what's legal and what's ethical, and it's important to know the difference. And we also know that in our court system, it takes a willing plaintiff to sue. The courts can't just pluck cases, out of the garden and make decisions about them. It takes somebody that has the ability and standing to say that they have been harmed in some way, or they have an actual case or controversy, and finding a plaintiff that might have been willing to pursue that legal remedy. It's a moot point now. Yes, ma'am.
So the other thing that interested me is if the court is leaning to the right and they select their cases, will there now be a bias in the cases that get selected? My word, sorry.
No, yeah. So I teach a class in the spring called Judicial Process, and we learn about the inner workings of the court. We know that the Supreme Court is a very, cloistered body, and we learn about their decision making only through, the journal keeping or interviewing clerks. But what is known is that it takes 4 justices to say, yes, we want to hear this case. The rule of 4. And so many judicial scholars, point to the ability to set the agenda as one of the Supreme Court's policy-making powers. That if they see a case that could potentially change public policy, and there are 4 of them that think it's important enough to hear it, then they can pluck it and put it on the docket. So that is the ability to shape the docket. Those, yes, our Supreme Court justices have that ability. And when you have a partisan split and a group of 4 wants to hear a certain issue to potentially overturn a case or to uphold it for policy purposes, then yes, that's possible. And it only takes 4.
So how does the Supreme Court not start to become very political if it takes 50 senators to select the Supreme Court justice? Then you have a Supreme Court that is filled with political selection, and then you have cases that are voted by
I mean, one thing that I do think is important to note is that this is not the first time in history when we've had hyper-partisan decision-making by the Supreme Court, right? We know that FDR would get on the radio and rail against those four horsemen of the apocalypse, as he called them, that refused to uphold any of the legislation that the supermajority Democratic Congress and he wanted to put in place to dig us out of the Great Depression. But he was pressuring Congress to increase the membership on the court. He was pressuring Congress to make rules about mandatory retirement. And that's something that Congress can do. You know, the Congress can create new courts and the Congress can take away courts. They're constantly saying that we should split up the West Coast Court of Appeals, right, the Ninth Circuit, and create more courts of appeals out there. And Congress can do that. We know that our founders, essentially, the only court that they created was the United States Supreme Court, and they didn't say how many people would staff it or any other types of restrictions on the personnel that could take those seats. They said, and all of the details we leave to Congress. And the first act of Congress was the Judiciary Act of 1789, where they created our trial courts and our courts of appeals, and they decided how many Supreme Court justices we would have. And the types of, and in addition to the original jurisdiction types of cases that they said would automatically be heard by the Supreme Court, public ministers and consuls, disputes between states. But other than that, Congress is in charge. So Congress could legitimately increase the number of justices or shrink it or create retirement age limits, or, you know, that's another channel that could be used, a political channel, to shift the way that policy is currently being interpreted by the court. Yes, ma'am.
I'm very interested in your seeing how the demographics are becoming of judges much less like the demographics of the country. And, you know, I've looked at the polls and I've looked at the demographics, and the future of our country is not old white guys.
I love my papa. I love my daddy. You know, and they're right.
Are we seeing a concentrated, strategic effort to, in a sense, pack the court to maintain control of a really changing demographic?
I mean, that's what we're seeing. You know, it was a priority of Jimmy Carter to diversify the bench. It was a priority of Reagan to undo that. And it ebbs and flows with the people that give counsel to the president and who's in charge of the Justice Department. And when you see who's currently in charge of the Justice Department, Jefferson Beauregard Sessions III, then you can see the priorities that the Justice Department has with regard to who staffs the court. And so, yeah, you know, I absolutely believe that there are brilliant, reasonable old white men that can staff our court and make great decisions. Absolutely. It's not fair to say that just because you're white or you're a man that you're not going to make good decisions or be fair. But I do think that studies show that over time, if you have collegial bodies that include women, that include members of our society that have different ethnic and religious backgrounds, that brings a different point of view to the table. And that doesn't mean that point of view will win the day, but it can potentially get in people's ears and open people's perspectives. And so, yes, I think it is a very intentional effort. Just like it was an intentional effort of other administrations to create a more diverse population on the bench. Yes, sir.
Isn't this more about ideology, though? Would Amy Coney Barrett have
Yes, and let me tell you why. Because I went to Rhodes College with her. Amy Coney Barrett was on the short list, and she and I were sorority sisters. She was a senior when I was a freshman, and she is a Court of Appeals judge now. She was a professor at Notre Dame. She is kind, thoughtful, reasonable. People get along with her. She listens to people, and she would never have behaved that way in a confirmation hearing, yelling questions back to senators. And even though we may be diametrically opposed on many policy issues, I would trust her with my life. And even though she is super conservative, she's still thoughtful, and she still does her homework, and she's still, I was raised in East Tennessee, and I was told that it was illegal to drink before I was 21. And I'm not saying that I didn't pick up a beer the minute that I got to Rhodes College at age 18, but I did not drink in high school because I knew it was illegal, and I didn't want to disappoint my parents. And the fact that there's somebody serving on our United States Supreme Court right now that clearly didn't have any problem with breaking the law as a youth, and I'm not just talking about sexual harassment, I'm talking about decisions about your moral character and the way you behave and whether or not you obey the law. It really gets in my craw that somebody admittedly was a lawbreaker. And I know that maybe everybody in this room was an underage drinker. But in my opinion, the Supreme Court should be staffed by goody two-shoes and people that care about upholding the law and setting a good example for our youth. And how am I going to explain to my son that he can't drink as a 15-year-old when we know that one of our Supreme Court justices, the most lauded position, in my opinion, in our government system, is a lawbreaker, admittedly, flagrantly, recorded it in his dang yearbook. It's, to me, that's bothersome. It is. They should be held to a higher standard. They should be expected to uphold the law and obey the law. And I know we all speed. We all do, none of us are perfect. We are all sinners. But our Supreme Court justices should be held to a higher standard. Yes, ma'am. Can a Supreme Court justice be impeached?
If so, how soon?
Well, here's the thing, folks. It takes the House to start the process, right? And we can dream about impeaching all kinds of people that are associated with the executive branch or the judicial branch, but unless you have a majority of the House of Representatives willing to bring the impeachment process forward, they're the ones that start it, and then the individual would be tried in the Senate. And so our thoughts about bringing people to be held accountable for breaking the law really are irrelevant unless the members of our Congress are willing to hold people to that standard. Now, that being said, there is no statute of limitations on sexual assault, and we know that if the district attorney in that Maryland county where that incident happened so long ago wanted to open up a case, that that could create it, but I'm not sure that would, the American people have heard it, the senators have heard it, everybody formed their own opinion, and he was still confirmed. So, yeah. Yes, ma'am.
So, in the hearings, Kavanaugh definitely showed a bias politically. Do you think you should have to recuse recuse himself in cases that have political bias? I mean, because he's, again, said a lot of things on record that showed he wasn't an impartial judge.
Well, the justices, they decide themselves, for themselves, if they are going to recuse themselves from cases. We know that Justice Scalia's son was of counsel in Bush versus Gore in 2000, and he did not think that he needed to, and he was of counsel for George Bush, and he refused to recuse himself. So there's not, it's really a function of the moral compass of the justice themselves. And we know that some of our justices have said, look, I can't be impartial. Could we expect the same from Kavanaugh? I don't know. But I can tell you that judicial scholarship shows, again, that people move to the ideological pole over time after their appointment. And I don't foresee any shifts. The individuals that have shifted in another direction, you can count them on one hand. So I don't think we can anticipate a more centrist position or the willingness to recuse themselves. Because essentially what a justice would be doing is saying, no, I can't be impartial. And as anybody that loves, knows, and works with attorneys and judges knows, is admitting faults isn't a strong suit always of our justices. Yes, and then I want to get to people that haven't asked questions yet. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I just want to ask a question about the House versus the Senate. Is there any motion or movement afoot to have a lock-off or a lockdown on the number of years they can serve?
I haven't. Yes. So the question was, has there been any movement with regard to the House or the Senate wanting to put forth legislation that would create an age, a mandatory retirement age? No, is that what you're not saying? Oh, term limits for House and Senate members. You can imagine the efficacy, the willingness of House members or Senate members to limit themselves. No. And Arkansas, years ago, actually passed legislation. The people of the state voted to say that the people that they're going to send to Congress would get 2 terms. And our Supreme Court determined that that was unconstitutional. They overturned that popular legislation from the state of Arkansas where the people of Arkansas wanted to limit the terms that their own individuals would serve in the United States. And they said they could do it with regard to their state legislature because they're in charge of the composition of their state legislature. But, you're all very intelligent people. There's no, I don't think it would be reasonable to think that those individuals would want to limit themselves in that way. Although we have an opportunity to make a statement about that in our upcoming elections with regard to Metro, and if you have feelings or positions about term limits for our Metro City Council members, that's on the ballot this term in one of the amendments. They want to increase the number of terms they can serve to 3 from 2. And so if you care about term limits or feel strongly one way or the other about that, then you have the opportunity to express your vote on the entire council, is what I understand, all members of the council. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I think I remember when Kagan was put on the bench, that anything that she had started, where her name was written on it, she had to recuse herself from that. Kavanaugh has a number of things that he has authored. Would that be still up to him, or?
It is. It's still up to the individual justice whether or not they want to recuse themselves from cases. She was pointing out the fact that Justice Kagan, in her role in the Attorney General's office or Solicitor General's office? Solicitor General's office. She recused herself from many cases that came before the Supreme Court because she had played a role in the lower court litigation and decision making. But she did that because she thought that that was the appropriate thing to do. You know, and I'm not saying that he won't make the same decision. We have no idea. We'll just have to see if he's willing to recuse himself from cases where he played a role in the lower court decision making. Yes, sir.
From the time the Constitution was adopted, there's always been a critical division of opinion about how it should be interpreted, either strictly or more liberally, and that led to the founding of political parties in our country in the time of George Washington. Lately, I've heard talk about an originalist, and I think Anton Scalia was an originalist, and apparently Kavanaugh is supposed to be an originalist. Could you define an originalist, exactly what we're talking about?
Sure. So, yes, I will repeat and rephrase. So, when you study the courts and you study the Supreme Court specifically, you begin your lessons with the different lenses that the justices use when they are interpreting the Constitution. You learn about the different methods that they employ to make their decisions about what the Constitution mandates and requires. And one of those lenses is the originalist lens, which Justice Scalia was very famous for advocating. And that interpretation, that judicial methodology, asks of the user to look at the language of the Constitution itself and basically ask yourselves, what did the founders intend? And what would the founders do? I always put it on the PowerPoint slide as WWFD, what would the founders do? If there is a specific explicit answer to that question, then you go with that, according to the originalist methodology of interpreting the Constitution. So, for example, Justice Black from Alabama, he would look at the First Amendment and say, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. And he was like, it's clear enough to me that that's what they meant, and any law that Congress or a state legislature wants to pass that would abridge the freedom of speech is unconstitutional, because that's not how the authors intended our public policy to move forward. But the problem, and another aspect, positive aspect of an originalist interpretation is it's predictable, and originalists claim that because they use this lens from 1789 to interpret the Constitution, that they aren't beholden to modern policy controversies or problems, and that it's predictable, and that it's apolitical. But then you have the counter-argument that says, well, the drafters of the Constitution had their own policy preferences that they worked into this document, and it's naive to believe that that they would have us stuck in that era for constitutional interpretation. And so the polar opposite of originalism is the idea that it's a living document that should be interpreted in accordance with modern parlance and modern times, and that we shouldn't be stuck with the language that was used or the implications of the language that was used in 1789. And so other justices, famously Justice Brandeis, he was a social scientist who came on the court in the 19-teens, And he said it's our responsibility to use our God-given brains and to look at evidence when we are making these decisions, and to gather social data, and to consider the future implications of the decisions we're making, regardless of how this might just, they're supposed to make a decision just with regard to the parties that are before them. But he advocated a pragmatic point of view, one that considered future implications, and that also advocated for the use of data to inform the decisions, economic data, social science data, to help the court make their decisions. And that's not an originalist point of view. That is not bound to the terminology of 1789. So yeah, there are lots of different ways that our courts make the decisions that they make, and lenses that they use, looking to the way that the states are making decisions, or the circuits are making decisions, or other countries are making decisions. Some justices prefer that methodology. For example, with regard to states that were willing to put juveniles to death for violent crimes, we ended that process not until the late 90s, but part of the decision-making was looking to the way that our peer countries consider that issue. And at the time, we were in the company of Saudi Arabia and North Korea, and that's it, right? And Syria, with regard to putting to death juveniles who had committed violent crimes. So there are different ways that judges look at the Constitution and different guiding lights that they use, but just, I believe that judicial temperament calls for considering all of the facts and being willing to, I think all attorneys, all good attorneys are taught that that reasonable people can come to different conclusions, and that doesn't preclude either issue position, but that our job is to advocate for reasonableness. So with that, I think I'm done. Yes.